Everyone, welcome. So, welcome to today's Irish Studies seminar. It's a great pleasure for me today to welcome back to Queen's Dr. Aidan Enright, former PhD student here, worked with myself back in the day. And Aidan is currently a research administrator and part-time lecturer in history at Leeds Beckett University in Leeds, obviously. His PhD from Queen's formed the basis of his monograph, Charles Owen O'Conor, the O Conor Don, Landlordism, Liberal Catholicism and Unionism in 19th Century Ireland, which was published with Four Courts Press in 2022 and won a British Association for Irish Studies Book Prize in 2023. Aidan's research interests lie in liberal and conservative Catholicism, Catholic unionism and imperialism, and Irish, English and British Catholic identities in the 19th century. So it's great to have great to have Aidan back to speak to us on this subject. The title of today's presentation is A Symbol of West Britonism in Ireland, the O Conor Don and the Culture and Politics of Liberal Catholicism and Liberal Unionism, 1860 to 1906. Aidan.
Thank you, Peter. I'll just start my little stopwatch here, so I'll try and keep the time. Okay, so it's great to be here. I'm back in Belfast again, where the scene of the crime, as it were, where I did my PhD all those years ago, and with Peter as my supervisor. So yeah, it's nice to be back here to be given a paper on the book. So as political outlooks go, liberal Catholicism, stroke Catholic unionism are probably some of the most unpopular in modern Irish history, commonly referred to as West Britons in the late 19th century. Catholic unionists were seen as craven supporters of British rule in Ireland, who clung to a kind of a British, English, cultural, political tradition at the expense of an authentically Irish Gaelic culture and politics. And the life of Charles Owen O'Conor, the O Conor Don, more commonly known as the O Conor Don, bears witness to this unpopularity, if you like. He was a landlord at a time when landlordism was becoming even more unpopular than it already was. A liberal when liberalism was gradually sort of increasingly seen as a kind of a discredited political outlook. And a unionist when unionism was largely the preserve of Protestants. So he was in a somewhat of a funny position. But nonetheless, during his time in Parliament, he supported a wide range of social and economic reforms, but came undone over his opposition to Home Rule and fixity of tenure in the 1870s. And indeed, it was these issues that Charles Stewart Parnell focused on when, during the general election campaign of 1880, he denounced the O Conor Don as a symbol of West Britonism in Ireland and of Englishmen and England to rule Ireland. So I guess I would sort of pick that as a sort of a potentially catchy title, if you like, but there's a seriousness behind it as well, in the sense that it's looking at this idea that people like the O Conor Don, who don't sort of fit, if you like, the sort of traditional Catholic equals nationalist, Protestant equals unionist, sort of the dominant narratives, if you like, of certainly of 19th century Irish history, and setting it up there and saying, well, you know, there's another way of looking at this. It's slightly more complicated than that. It's not as black and white as that, and that the O Conor Don is a, if you like, a prime example of this, of somebody who doesn't sort of fit that bill. So hence the title. So who was the O Conor Don? So starting off with the O Conor Don's pedigree, background, if you like. So it was Gaelic. He's the O'Conor family were descendant, or that's the sort of thing that they emphasized in the 19th century and still do to this day. Clonala's house is still there in County Roscommon, and if you check out the website, much is made of the family's connections to the last High Kings of Ireland. And it was the same in the 19th century. The O'Conor Don wrote a book, a history of the O'Conors in the 1890s, and again, much was made of that sort of Gaelic lineage. Catholic, obviously, but again, that was important in the sense that a lot of the old Gaelic Catholic landowners, come the Reformation and the confiscation of land, Cromwell, etc., conformed to Protestantism in order to hold on to their estates. So the fact that the O'Conors didn't do that was a badge of honor, if you like, for the family, and something that, again, in the 19th century, was something that people made a big deal of, if you like. Not just the family, but it was seen as a positive thing by both his friends and his enemies. Landed, they owned, even though they had much of their property confiscated during the Cromwellian period, some 12,000 acres. Come the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, the O'Conor family started to build back up their estates through various means. Legal battles to retain land, litigation in the 17th century to hold on to 300 or 400 acres of land, and then once the penal laws started to be relaxed towards the end of the 18th century, they started to buy land, profitable marriages with other sort of Catholic merchant families, other landed families, lucky inheritance. So for various means of building back up their estates. So by the time the O'Conor Don came along in 1859, came of age in 1859, should I say, he was born in 1838, he inherited roughly 7,500 acres in counties of Scion and Sligo, and crucially £50,000, which I guess in today's change is something in the region of 3-4 million quid, which is not to be sneezed at. But these gentlemen here, on the right here, we've got Charles O'Conor of Balnagar, which some of you may or may not have heard of. And this is focusing on the liberal part of his background, the liberal political tradition. So Charles O'Conor of Balnagar was in sort of mid 1850s, 60s, 70s, was a sort of prominent historian, antiquarian, and political activist. Wrote several pamphlets under the pseudonym Liberal Protestant, making the case for the repeal of the penal laws, argued that Catholics should declare their loyalty to the Hanoverians in order to sort of ease the path towards repeal of the penal laws, which restricted obviously Catholics from owning land and various other things. So the argument has been made by Luke Gibbons and Kieran O'Connor that's sort of the beginnings of a kind of a nascent liberal Catholic political tradition in the late 18th century. And then following on from that, the gentleman in the middle there, Owen O'Conor, who was the O'Conor Don's grandfather. He was an ally of Daniel O'Connell in the 1810s and 1820s. And he obviously campaigned for Catholic emancipation and became a Liberal MP for County Roscommon in 1830. But he was only an MP for 1 year. He died in 1831. And his son, Dennis O'Connor, the O'Conor Don's father, inherited that seat. And again, he was an ally of Daniel O'Connell's, seen as kind of, I guess, sort of mediocre kind of backbench MP, if you like, in today's terminology. He wasn't particularly active in Parliament. But the crucial thing about Dennis is in 1846, he was offered junior lordship of the Treasury by Lord John Russell, and he accepted it, which obviously at the time, the famine was starting to become obviously a major issue in Irish and British politics at the time. And he was referred to in 1847 in the Nation newspaper as the O'Conor didn't, not the O'Conor Don, who basically sat back and watched as 1 million of his people starved to death. So controversy around that, obviously, at the time, but it didn't seem to particularly affect. He died in 1847, Dennis O'Conor as well. So, but it didn't seem to particularly affect the standing of the family in the county. But that's the background. That's the sort of pedigree: Gaelic, Catholic, landed, liberal. That was the O'Conor Don's inheritance when he came of age in 1859. So here he is. This is Charles Owen here standing. I don't know the year of this. That's his younger brother, Dennis Morris O'Conor. So you would have seen this, Peter, in the house when he came in on the right hand side. This absolutely massive, about the size of that back wall there, painting hung up on the wall of Charles Owen and Dennis. So I'm assuming this is when they were on the Grand Tour. It looks like something like that. I don't know, but I'm not sure. So he was educated privately at Clonallis and at their Dublin residence in Kingston. They rented a house in Dublin. And then he went on to Downside College in Bath, in the southwest of England. Now, this was fairly typical for young Catholic gentlemen in the sort of, well, certainly from the early 19th century onwards. The sons of the landed Catholic elite in Ireland were sent to English Catholic colleges that were seen as prestigious and a kind of a gateway to especially after emancipation, a gateway to if you like, the higher echelons of British and Irish politics, and a way for them to network in the sort of Westminster scene, if you like. So he followed that very typical path. He was preparing for a degree at the University of London while at Downside, but became ill in 1859. Again, I'm not sure what was up with him, but he went on the Grand Tour instead. So he can't have been that bad. But it was seen, typically as a way to recover and recuperate, the warm air and the waters and all the rest of it, I guess. So he went on a Grand Tour. He had various tutors appointed by Cardinal Wiseman and Cardinal Newman, so he was well connected, clearly. I don't know who made those connections, maybe his aunts who were looking after him. One thing I didn't say, actually, sorry, was it's important to know that, as I said, O'Conor Don's father died in 1847, but his mother had already passed away in 1841. So the O'Conor children were orphans, essentially. So the O'Conor Don was the oldest boy. Dennis Morris was the next one, but he had 5 older sisters, all of whom went on to become nuns, were sent to Princethorpe in I think just outside Coventry. So his young life was managed basically by his aunts, Jane and Honoria O'Conor, Dennis's sisters. So there's a story there to be told as well. This is a very male-dominated story, the O'Conor Don story, but there is a story there to be told in terms of the power and influence of women in the O'Conor family and in the wider sort of Catholic elite scene, if you like. So that's sort of a bit of slight detour. But so yeah, he took the fairly typical path, English Catholic education, would have taken his degree if he hadn't become ill, went on the Grand Tour, came back in 1859, well, actually in 1860. During the general election of 1859, he was asked to stand for the Roscommon, for his father's seat, which was held by Oliver Grace, another landed Catholic in County Roscommon. He took over Dennis's seat in 1847, and then he stood down in 1859. They asked the O'Conor Don to stand, said he was too young, wouldn't do it. A Tory won the seat. He became unseated, bribery and undue influences in 1860. And then there was a by-election, and then the O'Conor Don was asked again, and he came back, and he obviously won the seat unopposed. So that's the sort of the beginning of his life. But the important thing to remember, I guess, is that he was part of a fairly exclusive British-Irish Catholic elite who, from emancipation onwards, were basically landed Catholics in Ireland and England, mostly English landed Catholics, who were mixing in the same clubs as the Stafford Club in London, intermarrying on a fairly extensive scale. Now, the English landed Catholic elite were a fairly small group of people. even smaller than the Irish landed Catholics, but they had their own circle, if you like, in London. And as we shall see, the O'Conor Don did marry an English Catholic, but they were also part of the wider and obviously still predominantly Protestant British Irish establishment. You know, they moved in the same circles. Yes, they had their own clubs, but they also went to the Reform Club. They were obviously Catholic MPs, so they were in Westminster. They were mixing freely with obviously you know, Protestant MPs in Westminster circles. So they started to get jobs, government jobs. Dennis O'Connor was getting more, you know, junior of the Treasury. So they were becoming gradually part of the establishment, but awkwardly so. And you know, obviously that there was various issues, in which one of which is education, which we'll touch upon. Obviously, the power and influence of the Catholic Church in Ireland, papal infallibility, all those things made this sort of relationship, if you like, or the place of Catholic elites in the wider British establishment slightly uncomfortable from time to time, shall we say. So that's the background, the upbringing. So here we are with the O'Conor Don elected as an MP in 1860. But before we move on to that, this is a sort of a neat sort of encapsulation, if you like, of what I'm talking about in terms of that the interconnections between the Catholic elite, but also how they sort of moved in the wider British establishment. So first of all, the O'Conor Don was actually due to marry the daughter of a local Protestant landowner in County Roscommon, E.K. Tennyson, Edward King Tennyson, in 1864. Now, I haven't quite got to the bottom of what happened there, but I do know from his diaries there are various references to meeting up with the Tennysons, obviously in the country house in Roscommon. It's Kilronan Castle now. That was the Tennyson. It was Tennyson Castle, which is now Kilronan Castle in County Roscommon. Very popular wedding venue. But they various references to meeting the Tennysons in Rome as well. So whether Miss Tennyson was supposed to convert or what the arrangement was, I'm not quite sure. But it all went pear-shaped anyway. They didn't get married, and old Edward King Tennyson was not a fan of the O'Conor Don after that. So something obviously went awfully wrong, or the O'Conor Don was perceived by Tennyson to have done something inappropriate or whatever, or not stuck to whatever agreement they had, or I'm not quite sure. But they didn't get married. So eventually in 1868, he did get married, and he married a lady called Georgina Perry, the lady here on the left. Now she was from a fairly sort of middle-ranking English landed Catholic family in Warwickshire, a place called Avondasset, I think it's called. So, you know, as I say, it's part of that picture of mixing. You know, he obviously met her at the balls in London. It was clearly a marriage based on religion and class, but also clearly from their diaries they were very smitten with each other, and it seemed to be very much a marriage based on love as well. So they got married in 1868. She moved over to Clonallis. But again, from actually looking at the O'Conor Don's brother's diary, it seems pretty clear that she was pretty much ill from the get-go. But she still managed to have 4 children, 2 boys and 4 boys, 2 singles and a set of twins, and died in 1872. She was only 25, I think. So yeah, pretty sad, really. And he was genuinely broken-hearted after us, and but he did marry again a second time. This time to the daughter of a landed Irish Catholic, the Moore O'Farrell family, based out of Longford, Kildare and Longford, I think. Ellen Moore O'Farrell, her father was James Lewis Moore O'Farrell, who was the head of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Her uncle would have been Richard Moore O'Farrell, who was the governor of Malta from 1847 to 1850, who I've done a bit of research on recently. But anyway, so it's just to give you that general picture of the circles, that the milieu, if you like, of the O'Conor Don is sort of plays out in his various marriage arrangements, or not, as the case may be with the first one. So I just thought that might be a slightly sort of different way of looking at it, and trying to make the story of the O'Conor Don less male. But anyway, here we go. So landlord and Liberal MP, 1860 to 1880. So as I say, he was elected in a by-election, first elected in a by-election in 1860. And he was returned unopposed again in 1865, 1868, and 1874. And as I say here, he was part of a wider group of liberal Catholics who supported a wide range of social and economic reforms within the Union. So again, to give you a flavour, if you like, the O'Conor Don's contemporaries were people like Richard Moore O'Farrell, who was an MP in the 1830s, then went on to become colonial governor, then I think became an MP again for a short while. Miles O'Reilly, Major Miles O'Reilly, I see Marie nodding back there. He was the MP for Longford, one of those. But also interestingly, he was the head of the Irish Brigade in the Pope's Papal Army of Swas, or whatever they were called, in 1860. And even though they were resoundingly beaten, he was given a hero's welcome when he came back to Ireland, and sort of defeat was turned into victory. And he came back, and then Julie was elected Liberal MP for Longford or Louth, whichever one it was. So he was a direct contemporary of the O'Conor Don. Who else? Sir Dominic Corrigan, another one. He was a doctor, became an MP. William Monsell, another one. Convert, a sort of acolyte of Newman's. He was particularly close to O'Conor Don, actually. They sort of would have met up on a regular basis and shared their views. So I'm trying to think. You had the sort of Catholic peers, the Earls of Kenmare, Granard was another convert, Fingal. And then sort of outside of that again, you had a kind of I'm going to say a well-educated professional middle class types, if you like. So the likes of Sir Patrick Keenan, who was an education commissioner, James Kavanagh, who was, I think, the head of national schools, Thomas Maguire, who went on to become a professor of Latin at the University, Queen's College, Galway at the time. So there was a sort of a wider sort of milieu around these sort of elites, if you like, who were sort of well-educated, aspirational, if you like to use sort of contemporary terms, Catholic middle class, who were sort of part of that wider sort of liberal Catholic milieu in the 1860s and 1870s. So that's to give you sort of an indication of the politics. Now, as a landlord, the O'Conor Don, as I say, inherited £50,000. And the interesting thing about that is, and slightly controversial, is he inherited from a cousin called Edward Moore, who was a landowner in Australia and part owner of slave plantation in Antigua. So obviously that is problematic. But the O'Conor Don used that £50,000 to buy, so as I say, inherited about £7,500, or 7,500 acres, sorry. And he increased his estates by about 5,000 acres. So by the late 1870s, he was the owner of roughly 12,500 acres, mostly in County Roscommon, but some in County Sligo as well. So he was sort of mid-ranking, if you like, sort of on the landed elite scale, if you like, in terms of the amount of land that he owned. He built a new house as well, Clonellis House, which is still there, as I say. He built that, started it in 1878, finished it in 1880. So not the most opportune time to be building a new house, but it didn't seem to have any sort of negative effects, if you like, in terms of his reputation in the local area. There was there's a little bit of a story attached to that as well. Old Connor's house is where his first wife died. There was obviously a negative attachment to that. There was apparently issues of dampness in the house, so it wasn't just that he was sort of splashing his money around, if you like. And obviously it's a big house, but relative to other big houses that were built around this time, it was fairly modest. I know obviously it's a pretty big house, but in relative terms. So, for example, I think the Earl of Kinnair embarked on building an absolutely humongous house down in County Kerry, and it all went pear-shaped, and he lost a lot of money on it. And so, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the O'Conor Don he inherited money. He was a fairly well-to-do man, obviously, but he managed his money well. He was prudent. He invested in more land, which is, I guess, always a good thing if you're a landowner. And he built a new house, but not a particularly extravagant one, and he didn't overreach, and he didn't make a mess of it. So that's where he's coming from in terms of his sort of financial position and his role as a landlord. But also he did manage to maintain stable relations with his tenants, even throughout the 1880s and 1890s, at the height of the Land League and Planet Campaign agitation. And Roscommon was a particularly active county on that front. Most of the estates around the O'Conor Don were alive with no rent campaigns, attacks on landlords, assassination of landlords. So I think in general what we can say is that obviously being in a stable financial position helped, because the Land League and Planet Campaign tended to target landlords who they knew were in trouble. So the idea was, well, if we have an over-rent campaign, that will break them financially. That probably wouldn't have worked with the O'Conor Don if they tried it, but they didn't. There were some efforts made during the Planet Campaign to start an over-rent campaign, but seemingly the tenants weren't having it. So he was very lenient in the collection of rent and following up on arrears. Again, he could afford to do that, I guess. But he was generally a proactive landlord. He didn't spend all his time in London. He was constantly over and back between Connors, Dublin, London. Regularly walked his estates and knew his tenants. Was on site when they were bringing in the turf and collecting the spuds and making the hay, and so he was known to his tenants. They liked him. He was well respected. He was generally perceived to be, at the time and since, in the historiography, I guess, he's generally perceived to be one of the good landlords. So I think that meant a lot in terms of sort of bolstering his position as well as an MP. It would have helped, but it wasn't all plain sailing for the O'Conor Don. So I sort of tried to sort of give this a heading as sort of political tensions and downfall. So to say, he was elected in 1860, but he did struggle to sort of reconcile his liberalism, if you like, with what I describe in the book as sort of Whiggish views on government and democracy. So in 1865-66, I think when he was in America, so he went on a tour of America at the very tail end of the Civil War, he wrote an essay on representative government. And in that essay, he basically outlines what you might call a Whiggish view, but I think it was a fairly common view amongst many Liberal MPs right up to the 1880s, where the general view was that government was the responsibility of a well-educated, benevolent, natural ruling elite. That was essentially his position, that democracy was all good and well, but that it needed to be tempered and that it needed to be guided by people such as himself. As I say, it wasn't an uncommon view at that time. I would say, maybe I'm wrong, but so obviously that sort of came up against the the wall of the rise of Irish nationalism towards the end of the 1870s and then going into the 1880s. Now, these weren't views that he made particularly explicit, if you like, publicly, but he did make it clear in the 1870s, when he was having trouble over the issues of fixity of tenure and home rule, that he took a fairly sort of Burkean view of the role of a public representative, that yes, he needed to listen to the views of his constituents, but that he should be at liberty to represent the interests of his constituency as he saw fit. So in other words, in line with his own views on what he thought was right for the country. So it's a kind of a version of the modern day argument about parliamentary representation. You know, are you a delegate? Are you a representative? You know, he was very much on the view that he was a representative, that it was, yes, that he should take heed of the popular view, but that it needed to be guided, that he should have the freedom to make a judgment about what was in the best interest of the country. And if that meant that it was the opposite view of the popular will, well, then so be it. That was his view, essentially. And that became problematic for him on the issues of home rule and fixity of tenure. So in 1873, there was a Home Rule Conference. The Home Rule Party had been established in 1870. There was a Home Rule Conference in the lead up to the general election of 1874. And the O'Conor basically stated his opposition to Isaac Butt's proposals for federal home rule, on the basis that it was a federal, Butt proposed federalism, and the O'Conor basically said, well, that's just not going to work because you know, there's no way you're going to get that in the imperial parliament. There's no way that you know, you need to establish some sort of agreement first, you know, in terms of whether Scotland and England want their own parliaments. And then he mentioned the rather uncomfortable issue of Irish unionist opposition to home rule and the likelihood that that would cause division in the country. So, you know, that was him taking his own line, if you like, against what was perceived to be the popular will at the time. So that was one sort of particular tension and difficulty for him. His liberalism also sort of came into conflict with sort of, on the one hand, secularism, and on the other hand, ultramontanism. So secularism, in the sense that the most obvious example is the education question. So the O'Conor campaigned a lot on the issue of university education, and basically that, from his point of view, that the university education system in Ireland was unfair towards Catholics, that it was dominated by Trinity College Dublin and the Queen's Colleges. Obviously, Trinity was a predominantly Protestant university. The Queen's Colleges were secular, but from the Conor Don's point of view, that was a bit of a charade, that they were basically favourable towards, you know, the teachings of Protestantism and Irish Protestants, and that, you know, Catholics should have their sort of religious sensibilities catered for within the university system. So that sort of went against, if you like, the sort of drive towards a secular education system in Ireland and in Britain at the time. You had the national establishment of the national schools in Britain, the Forster Act in 1870. Yeah. So that, you know, that created a difference between Catholics within the Liberal Party in the House of Commons and, you know, Liberal Catholics and Liberal Protestants within Gladstone's Liberal Party. And that sort of all came to a head in 1873 when Gladstone introduced the University Bill, created a national university in Ireland, Trinity College Dublin, attached to that, and a Catholic college attached to that. Trinity maintained its funding, no funding for the Catholic universities. The O'Conor opposes the bill. The majority of Liberal Catholics oppose the bill. The bill is defeated by 3 votes. Gladstone government falls. So that's a sort of a, you know, a tension within the O'Conor liberalism and how that sat within the Liberal Party more widely at the time, sort of particularly sort of late 1860s, early 1870s. And then on the other hand, sort of the opposite end of that, ultramontanism or ultramontanism, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. So the the influence of the Catholic Church. So the general perception in the historiography is that liberal Catholic MPs, like the O'Conor Don, were basically parroting the views of the Catholic bishops on the education question. Now, I argue in the book that that's not necessarily the case, because people like the O'Conor Don were taught in Catholic colleges, were sincere Catholics, and held a view on education. Now, the O'Conor Don's view was that the liberal position was that you should be free to have, the actual liberal position was the freedom to have the education that you wanted within, you know, a national system of education. So that Catholics should be free to have a Catholic education if they so wished, and Protestants should be free to have a Protestant education if they so wished. And that if the state was going to intervene in that, it should, if it's so, for example, if the state's going to fund education, it should fund more equally. So that was his argument. So it was essentially a different view of what it meant to be a liberal, if you like. But that's the way I see it, and that's the argument I make in the book. But the perception more widely in the Liberal Party was that liberal Catholic MPs like the O'Conor Don were basically parroting the views. So because they were saying we want a Catholic university, well, then that's just the bishops, isn't it? I don't think it's as simple as that. So that's where the ultramontanism comes. You know, the rise of an ultramontane Catholic Church dictating the views of Catholic MPs. Papal infallibility in 1870 reinforced that in the minds of many liberal Protestants. Gladstone comes out in 1874 and publishes a pamphlet basically saying that Catholics, this is after the defeat of the university bill, he wasn't particularly happy about that, obviously, basically saying that Catholics were incapable of being loyal to the state because they were influenced by the temporal power of the Pope and the Catholic Church in political affairs. So these are the tensions, the conflicts within the O'Conor Don's liberalism, if you like. And he lost his seat. As I say, he was returned unopposed in 1865, 1868. That was on the crest of the wave of sort of Gladstonian liberalism. The thing I should say as well is that the O'Conor Don and, you know, Thomas O'Hagan, William Monsell, Dominic Corrigan, Miles O'Reilly, they all thought Gladstone was brilliant. You know, Gladstone in 1868 was a great man who was going to do justice for Ireland. He actually literally said that at his brother's election campaign in Sligo in 1868, because his brother also became an MP in 1868 for County Sligo. So they were very disappointed by the university bill in 1873. They were felt very let down, if you like, by Gladstone. Although some did back him. Monsell, obviously, an obvious example, but he was a government minister, so I guess he had to. So, you know, they were in a difficult position come the mid-1870s. They were never terribly popular, shall we say, but they were in a very tricky spot. Gladstone government falls, Home Rule movements starting to pick up momentum. The land question is coming to the fore again. But brings forward land bills for fixity of tenure. Again, the O'Conor Don opposes it on the basis that it won't work. It's the popular view. But the O'Conor Don essentially argues that, well, if you've got fixity of tenure, so in other words, the tenant has a lease for a fixed period of time at a set rent, okay? His argument was that's just not going to work, because the landlord is going to feel that he's losing some of his property rights. The tenant's going to feel like, well, I kind of own this, and none of them are going to be happy. So again, that made him very unpopular. But he attended public meetings in Roscommon and reasserted his views on what the role of a representative was quite clearly. But yet he was returned in 1874, but unopposed. He was returned as the Home Rule candidate in 1874, but by the local Home Government Association. But there was no other candidates, and he did not call himself a Home Rule candidate. They called him a Home Rule candidate, I think, probably to save face. So yeah, as I say, he lost his seat in 1880, and Parnell played a big part in that. As I said at the beginning, Parnell visited the constituency, denounced him as West Briton. But the thing about it is, Parnell apparently approached the O'Conor Don to come on side, and the O'Conor Don wasn't having any of it. And there was only supposed to be one candidate, Andrew Commons, one Home Rule candidate. So then Parnell's from another candidate on him, J.J. O'Kelly. And apparently the agreement was Commons had told the O Conor Don that if there is another candidate, I'll step down and there'll just be two candidates. But the O Conor Don said, no, I'll take both of you on. And he lost his seat. So a certain amount of hubris, I'm afraid, also brought about his downfall. So that's the sort of general sort of, if you like, picture of the tensions within liberal Catholicism, the difficulties that the Conor Don's views on government and democracy, the conflict between secularism and ultramontanism, conservative Catholicism, you could maybe call it that, and how that all played out within the Liberal Party in the sort of 1860s and 1870s. And then, you know, leading up to sort of Parnell's ascension as the leader of the Home Rule Party and the issues of Home Rule and fixity of tenure. And again, the O'Conor Don sort of unpopular views on those. And that's, you know, essentially what put the nail in the coffin for him. Right, okay, so from liberalism to unionism, where are we? Oh God, nearly 40 minutes. So essentially, yeah, the O'Conor Don, you know, was obviously not on the front line of politics anymore, but he did sort of use his connections and links within sort of Westminster circles to continue campaigning for land purchase, for land reform, local government reform, and proportional representation. He was involved quite, I don't think it was a very heavy involvement, but he was invited to join the Proportional Representation Society in 1884, I think. So basically, his position, you know, come the 1886 and the first Home Rule Bill was that, you know, in the aftermath of the Land League and the Planning Campaign, that, you know, Home Rule, nationalist-dominated Parliament in Dublin would lead to, it was a fairly standard unionist position that it would lead to, was a stepping stone towards independence, and that would lead to the breakup of the Union and the Empire. And he sort of made the additional argument that a nationalist Parliament couldn't deal fairly with the land question. So, you know, he was in the background, using his networks to try and influence government policy, particularly on land purchase. So he was still maintained a sort of level of influence, if you like, but he was very much in the background. In 1893, he wrote a pamphlet against Home Rule, for the second Home Rule Bill, called The Unsolved Irish Problem, where basically, again, he made the same arguments about the breakup of the Empire, the danger of dealing with the land question in a nationalist-dominated Parliament, anti-landlord nationalist-dominated Parliament. But he also sort of talked about the issue of Irish nationality and Irish identity, and essentially made the point that it ought to be possible, if you like, to have an Irish national identity that incorporated a form of British identity, that it was possible essentially to be both. So, you know, it's quite a complicated picture, if you like, at this point, where he's still trying to influence policy and ideas, but from afar. And he's becoming more entrenched in his opposition to Home Rule, and obviously the experience of the Land League, you know, even though he didn't directly experience it himself, he was appalled by the methods that were used during the Land League and the Planning Campaign agitations. And, you know, that really did convince him that, you know, a nationalist Parliament would lead to sort of all sorts of divisions in Irish society. And, you know, but he did remain a critic of the Union. So in 1893, well, there's a set of typed recollections in the O'Conor archive, and this is the O'Conor reflecting obviously on his life, and he claims in 1893 to be no lover of the Union. I use that as one of the titles for my chapter, but this is a recollection. But at the time, in 1893, he was supposed to attend a unionist demonstration in Dublin, but he didn't attend it. And in his recollections, he says he didn't attend it because he was no lover of the Union. But actually, if you look at the record in the newspapers, he writes a letter to the Freeman's Journal saying he would have attended the unionist demonstration, but he couldn't because of a personal engagement. And he also signed a Catholic Unionist petition at that time in 1893 in opposition to Home Rule. So I think in the recollections there's an attempt there to sort of massage the story a little bit. But he did remain a critic of the Union. I think, essentially he thought that Ireland was treated as an inferior partner within the Union. And that, sort of British government, didn't really address the land question properly or in a timely fashion. So that's where he ended up. Towards the end in the 1890s, obviously he's getting on in years. Redmond just tried to bring him on side during the local elections in 1898. The establishment of local government in Ireland. He sort of makes the argument that the O'Conor should be tolerated. The O'Conor wasn't interested in that, but he did stand for election. He did get elected, but stood down about a year later because he fell out with the nationalist local council over the issue of the Boer War. So he didn't last very long there either. He was involved in the background scenes of the Land Conference, 1902, 1903. Again, was still making the argument that there need to be sort of extensive land purchase in Ireland to solve the land question. So he was still sort of in the background again, but becoming less and less influential. So that's pretty much it. I just finished with a few sort of concluding remarks, if you like. So the O'Conor Don is liberal Catholic unionist world. So obviously largely drawn from the landed gentry and the professional upper and middle classes. Usually, but not always, college and university educated. Usually, but not always, pursued careers in politics, the civil service, the colonial service, the army, and the professions. When I say the professions, I mean academia, medical profession, law, that kind of thing. Generally speaking, supported Ireland's connection to Great Britain through the Crown, the Union, and the Empire. Saw themselves as staunchly Catholic and Irish, but also remained sort of an attachment to Britain and certainly a sort of a British imperial identity. Undoubtedly a minority, but perhaps a larger minority than we might think. Question mark around that. There's some further research to be done there, and sort of finishing that point. There is more work to be done on the extent of Catholic land ownership in the 19th century. I've only sort of, the O'Conor Don is a really useful window into that world, but there's a lot more to be done, and the sources are there. More work to be done on sort of upper middle class Catholic life in the 19th century, I would say. Liberal Catholicism as a sort of a political credo. More work to be done on that, and ultramontanism, conservatism, that kind of ultramontanism I find a very sort of difficult term to get my head around. I think there's probably at the very least a journal article on that. And then Catholic unionism, where does Catholic unionists fit into the wider picture of Irish unionism towards the end of the 19th century? So, the O'Conor Don is a window into that world, but there's a lot done, more to do, I guess. That's it. So,
take a seat, Adrian. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Spinning the world of the O'Conor Don to us. I'm sure there'll be questions. Let's open it up to the floor, and if anyone online who's joining us has questions, just raise your hand. Digitally, Marie, we'll start.
Yeah, I wonder when his land, the 12,000 acres, and obviously he was a good landlord and was being involved in the land conference. When did he start to divest himself of his land? Did he sell it on the original land act, or did he wait till 1903? He actually sold his first piece of land in 1879 under the Landed Estates Court in Sligo. He sold part of the Sligo estates, which again wasn't. That tended to be what landlords tended to do. They would sell outlying parts of their estates. Yeah. So he sold off, 200-300 acres of his Sligo estates in 1879. But then he sold various bits under small amounts of land under the 1885, 88, 91 Land Acts. But the big chunk. Yeah, yeah. So the big chunk went under 1903. Just my impression is that most of it was sorted out before he died, but actually the process of it being sold happened shortly after he died, under his son's sort of watch. But yeah, he sold about, I think about somewhere in the region of 4,500 acres under the 1903 Land Act. Yeah, yeah.
Thinking about influences on his thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and one that came to mind was Lord Acton, Catholic, liberal, wrote about nationalism in a very critical way. Was there any kind of interaction with it?
He did, there's a few references in his diaries to having met Acton in Westminster, but he didn't move in Acton's circles. No. Acton was friends obviously with Gladstone, Monsell as well. So they had mutual friends. O'Conor was quite close to Monsell, but he didn't seem to move in those sort of intellectual circles, shall we say. Like the O'Conor Don, he was a thinker, but I wouldn't say he was an intellectual, if you like. He wasn't that productive in terms of producing pamphlets in the way that somebody like Acton would have been. But I think there was a tension within this liberal Catholic cohort that I'm talking about. So there was people like the O'Conor Don who were in favor of a Catholic education, and they saw that as the liberal position, as I tried to explain, in the sense that, you ought to be free to have, the liberal position was that you ought to be free to have a religious education if you so wish, whereas some liberals thought that the liberal position was a secular education, the education of Catholics and Protestants together, funded by the state, and that was the liberal position. So I make the argument that there's essentially two different views of what it meant to be liberal, which is not that unusual, I guess, within liberalism. To answer your question, I haven't got the impression that he was directly influenced by Acton. So on the education question, I'm not quite sure who he was influenced by, but he took what was a mainstream liberal Catholic position. The people who were fully supportive of secular education and denounced the Catholic Church and the rise of ultramontanism, people like Thomas Maguire, for example, who was a Catholic professor of Latin in Queen's College, Galway. Another guy called James Lowry Whittle, who was kind of an obscure Trinity-educated Catholic lawyer, who wrote several pamphlets attacking the Catholic Church in the late 1860s. So he didn't, and they would have seen themselves as allies of Acton, whereas the O'Conor Don was on the other side, I think. So where he was directly influenced by in terms of his views on education, I'm not quite sure.
I was thinking more of the national question.
Right, okay.
Nationalism and opposition to it, but
yeah,
arguing for an accommodation of different identities.
Right. Well, I would say he took, like, his views on home rule were it was a fairly typical unionist position, that the home rule would lead to the breakup of the Union and the Empire. Who he was influenced by, again, I'm not, like, he was close to Lord Dufferin, for example. He was influenced by Lord Dufferin's views on land reform. So maybe there was some influence there, but again, I'm not, like, I wasn't able to really get a sense of the books that he was reading, where he was getting his ideas from. There was no clear indication in any of the letters that I managed to get to view. So yeah, I'm not quite sure where his position on home rule and the Union came from. But I guess the argument that I tried to make in the book is that it was a fairly standard, conventional unionist view, in the sense, the reason that it gave for opposition to home rule. Sorry, that probably doesn't answer your question.
Sure.
Yeah, on the same question of the education issue and ultramontanism, I do find it a bit surprising in a way, because you've got to remember, there is a big split from Catholicism in the 19th century, Irish Catholicism, on this question. You take Cullen purges teaching stuff, for He systematically packs the hierarchy with people like himself. He's consciously shedding the legacy of people like Murray. Remember, Don Aiken said to me once, isn't significant. There is no official biography of Archbishop Murray, for example.
Yeah.
There's a nice long funeral sermon, but there's nothing like biography of, say, JKL. There's no biography. And Cullen can be quite vituperative about Catholics, and he sees as not having the right views.
Unsound.
Unsound, exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
But equally from the other side, I would expect the members of the aristocracy to look askance at the colonized church, with its emphasis on the overwhelming authority of the clergy over the laity, regardless of social status or anything else. And it's a rather brutal approach to public issues. Do we know anything about O'Conor Don's relationship with figures like Cullen and the bishops?
Yeah, so basically in the lead up to the sort of flashpoint is 1873. The O'Conor Dons didn't seem to have a particularly close relationship with Cullen. Like obviously he knows him, he visits him, but there's no extensive correspondence there that I'm aware of. I couldn't find any in the Clonald's archive. But the O'Conor Dons' view on education was, yes, the Catholic Church ought to have some influence over it, but not total, in the sense that, the way that Cullen was going about things, that the laity also should have input on the teaching of Catholics, whereas Cullen was, as you say, was sort of aiming for a total purge, wasn't he? So they kind of done, on the lead up to the bill, the 1873 University Bill, Bartholomew Woodlock, who was sort of basically Cullen's agent, if you like, in Westminster, was scurrying around Westminster Parliament trying to get a hold of the O'Conor Don and various other Edmund Dease and various other Dominic Corrigan, trying to influence them. But the O'Conor Don didn't want to meet him, didn't want to know about it, wanted to keep him at arm's length. So I think, again, it's a rather nuanced position, I think, but I think the O'Conor Don essentially agreed with the point that Catholics ought to have a Catholic education, but differed with the bishops on the bishops Cullen's aim to have an exclusively clerical education for Catholics. He didn't think that was right, and B, he didn't think that Catholic bishops should be getting over involved in politics, because that wasn't their place. A, it wasn't their place. B, it made his life difficult and made the chances of successful reform more difficult. So he's quite pragmatic in that sense. But yeah, it's a slightly nuanced position, I would say. But he didn't go in for the full throttle ultramontanism of Cullen. No.
Yeah, and that's another theory I'm doing. He's sort of caught in the middle between liberal belief and secularism on the one hand and ultramontanism on the other.
Yeah.
You're saying he's caught between those two.
Yeah, and couldn't really, like, I guess in one sense that is the story of the O'Conor Don's sort of political life. He couldn't really come down on one side or the other, and all these arguments and fights and positions. He sort of stood in the middle of the road and got ran over, if you like, on quite a few things, on the home rule as well. He was sort of giving out stink about, English arrogance and British Parliament's sort of ignorance of Irish issues, but at the same time he couldn't support home rule because, well, these nationalists are hand in glove with, the IRB and the Land League, and we can't have that either. I'm no lover of the Union, but he was less a lover of home rule. Do you know what I mean? And he got ran over.
Did he express an opinion on the Vatican Council's decree on infallibility?
Didn't. I couldn't find anything, and I looked. But again, that wasn't that unusual. I don't think amongst people like Acton aside, Catholics tended to keep their head down. Prominent Catholics like O'Connor, Monsell, O'Reilly, people like that, they tended not to. They would attend meetings and express a general support for the temporal power of the Pope, or they would, in 1870, obviously, you had the national sort of, attack on Rome, and well, no, that was 1860. Sorry.
Well, again in 1870.
Yeah, again in 1870. So they would express general support for the papacy, but they wouldn't. They didn't. And I looked through all the newspapers and all these meetings that they were having throughout the country, but they didn't tend to express a specific view on the issue of infallibility. And I couldn't find anything in any of the letters or diaries that I looked at, but I didn't look at all the archive. So there could be something in there, but I couldn't find it, unfortunately. My guess is that based on his other views and his tendency to take the middle position was that he probably thought, well, yes, the Pope should have some kind of temporal authority, but he shouldn't be putting it in black and white and the syllabus, syllabus errors and paper infallibility, that it's inopportune, I think was the word. It was an inopportune political position, and it makes life difficult for Catholics.
If I can just follow up on that, when there is a problem with liberal foreign policy in those Italian crises, 1859-60 and again in 1870, which must cause certain problems. I mean, in 1859, the Conservatives are making a pitch for Irish Catholic support, and get the highest number of Conservative MPs elected at any point in the post-1832. In the 1859 election, you had some prominent Catholic Conservatives like Pope Hennessy active at the time. So, for a young man finding his way into politics in 59-60, there's a family inheritance, but there are these kind of very difficult, problems, particularly with regard to kind of Palmerstonian foreign policy, which he has to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Is there any inkling at any point of consideration of taking a conservative line as opposed to a liberal line?
That's Johnny Wright asked me this question in Maynooth. Yeah, but no is the simple answer. But it's more complicated than that. So in 1859, as I say, he was asked to stand in the 1859 election because Oliver Gray stood down. But he said he couldn't do it. He was too young and he was faffing around over in Rome or whatever. But there was a lot of consternation in Roscommon at the time. His agent, Tom McDermott, who was a fairly significant landowner himself, he was a cousin of the O'Conor Dons, he was trying to organise the local Liberals to get a candidate who would beat the Conservative candidate, but they couldn't manage it, and that's why they were trying to get the O'Conor Dons to come back, and please come back, and we're going to lose this election, and they sort of they were aware of what was the sort of the Tory sort of challenge in 1859. But in the 1870s, there was various. So, for example, William Delaney, who was Father William Delaney, who was a teacher at Tullabeg, and was in correspondence with the O'Conor Don about the education question in 1879, was making all sorts of claims about Catholics going over to the Tories because of the education question. But the O'Conor Don wasn't having it. He did introduce the University Bill himself in 1879, which sort of forced the Conservatives' hand to introduce their own University Bill, which became the Royal University of Ireland. But no, there's no indication that he did say in the run-up to 1880 that he was approached by both Parnell and the Tories to stand as a nationalist or Tory candidate, respectively. But he was determined to remain an independent Liberal. So you could make the argument that his position, a lot of his positions were conservative in nature, I think. So springs to mind the land question. Part of his argument was that if the government introduces a large scheme of land purchase, well, then you give the tenant farmer ownership rights, and similar to Dufferin, you rend the tenant farmer conservative. He specifically says that. So that was, sort of a Dufferin kind of argument. So I think you could make the case that some of his views were conservative in nature, but no, I don't think he ever considered going over to the dark side, sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay. Look, any questions online? No? Yep. Okay. Any other questions?
Oh, actually, we do have one.
Okay, great. Go
ahead. John, if you want to unmute. John O'Hagan, if you want to unmute. Maybe not then.
That's funny. There was a John O'Hagan who wrote pamphlets on the education question in the 1870s. There you go.
Thank you. It's a wonderful portrait of the O'Conor Don and his time. The term West Brit or West Briton, how far back does that go? Does it go right back to the immediately after the Act of Union?
Well, I wrote a little piece on this for RTE Brainstorm, based on this, the O'Conor being labelled a West Briton. I did a bit of digging around on it, interestingly, and I think it goes back to about the 1830s. Actually, O'Connell in the 1830s, in the positive way, say, I would, if the British Parliament would introduce repeal and, treat Ireland with respect and fairness within the sort of the empire, I could be a West Briton myself. I think what's his name? Is it Thomas Wise? No, he wasn't. Not Thomas Wise. Shield. I can't remember. There was somebody else who used that term, and the prominent Irish politician at that time, who was a government minister or junior government minister, who said that he was quite comfortable with being a West Briton. But there seems to be a bit of a gap then from that period, the 1830s, up through to the sort of the 1860s and 70s, when it starts to be used, pejoratively as a negative thing, where, somebody like the O'Conor Don, or they were either called, they were variously called, they were Whigs, Castle Catholics, or West Brits. And they were all sort of, seemed to be sort of interchangeable. So a Whig was basically a government lackey, somebody who accepted a government job. And ergo, they're a Castle Catholic, they're a West Brit. So, I think in the, towards the sort of, in the 1870s, it started to be bandied around again, I think, but in a pejorative sense, as a negative term for somebody like the O'Conor Don, who wasn't sort of seen to be or perceived to be sort of properly Irish, should I? But obviously, he would have completely rejected that. And there are references in some of his newspaper articles where he sort of acknowledges the fact that I'd probably be called a Castle Catholic. He spells it C-A-W-S-T-L-E. So he's aware of how he's being portrayed, and he totally rejects it.
Okay. We didn't get John back, did we?
His hand went down now.
No, okay. Maybe just a slip of the button. Okay, I think maybe we'll wind up there for today. So for coming and talking to us about this subject. Aidan's book, The O'Conor Don, Landlordism, Liberal Catholicism and Unionism, 19th Century Ireland, is available in all good libraries and all good bookstores.
Yes,
So if you want to follow up on the themes today, that's the place to go to. So can we thank Aidan for coming and speak to us this afternoon? Perfect. Okay.